When World War II ended, Europe expected peace. The fighting stopped, the bombs disappeared, the war was over. But for Europe, the real crisis had just begun. Cities lay in ruins, factories were silent, money had lost its meaning, millions were hungry, homeless, and unemployed. Governments were broke, and trust was shattered. Europe hadn't just lost a war, it had lost its ability to function. For a brief moment in history, the entire continent stood dangerously close to economic collapse, political chaos, and social breakdown. So how did Europe almost fall apart, and how did it survive? By 1945, Europe was physically destroyed in a way few regions in history had ever experienced. Entire cities such as Berlin, Warsaw, and Dresden were reduced to rubble. Roads, bridges, railways, and ports were bombed beyond repair. Factories that once powered Europe's industrial strength were either destroyed or stripped of machinery. This wasn't just damage, it was paralysis. Without factories, nothing could be produced. Without transport, goods couldn't move. Without electricity and fuel, nothing could restart. Even basic coordination became impossible. Millions of soldiers returned home, expecting to rebuild their lives, only to find no jobs waiting. Farms had been abandoned for years, tools were missing, livestock had been killed or stolen. Food production collapsed across large parts of the continent. Even countries that technically won the war were exhausted. Britain emerged victorious, but financially drained and deeply in debt. France was liberated, yet economically shattered. Germany was defeated and completely broken with no functioning state. Europe wasn't simply poor, it was non-functional. And when an economy stops functioning, every other system begins to fail. One of the most serious problems after the war was money itself. During World War II, governments printed enormous amounts of currency to fund armies, weapons, and logistics. When the war ended, that money was still circulating, but production had collapsed. There were far more banknotes than actual goods. The result was inflation and mistrust. In many parts of Europe, cash became nearly useless. People didn't want paper money. They wanted food, fuel, clothing, or tools, anything with real, immediate value. Black markets exploded. Barter replaced formal currency. A pack of cigarettes could buy more than a stack of banknotes. Savings disappeared almost overnight. Middle-class families who had spent decades building financial security saw it vanish. Pensions lost value. Wages couldn't keep up with rising prices. When people lose faith in money, they lose faith in the system behind it. Governments struggled to collect taxes. They couldn't reliably pay workers or fund reconstruction. Banks were weak and unstable. Investment disappeared. Europe wasn't just facing an economic slowdown. It was experiencing a collapse of trust. And without trust, recovery becomes nearly impossible. As food shortages spread, everyday life became desperate for millions of Europeans. Rationing continued for years after the war officially ended. In many regions, people survived on barely enough calories to function. Winters were harsh, fuel was scarce, homes were damaged. Desperation created anger. Strikes broke out across industries. Protests spread through cities. People blamed governments for failing to deliver peace, stability, and basic necessities. For many, democracy felt slow and ineffective at a time when survival was the priority. At the same time, radical political ideas gained strength. Communism promised equality, guaranteed food, and security. Fascist remnants promised order, control, and national pride. Both offered simple answers to complex problems. Democracy, fragile and rebuilding, struggled to compete with these promises. Several European countries stood at a dangerous crossroads.
If economic collapse continued, Europe risked sliding into civil unrest, authoritarian rule, or even another large-scale conflict. The war had ended, but the conditions for another disaster were forming. History has shown that economic desperation often reshapes politics faster than ideology ever could. In theory, Europe should have rebuilt itself. It had skilled workers, industrial knowledge, and long economic traditions. But in reality, it simply didn't have the resources. Governments were drowning in debt after years of total war. Industries had no capital to restart production. Banks were weak and unstable. Infrastructure required massive investment that no single country could afford alone. Even Britain, once the richest empire in the world, was nearly bankrupt. It relied on emergency loans just to import food and fuel. Germany had no functioning state. France faced political instability. Italy was divided, poor, and struggling to govern effectively. Rebuilding required several things at once: money, raw materials, stable currencies, functioning trade networks, and long-term planning. Europe had almost none of these. Without outside support, recovery could take decades or fail entirely. A prolonged collapse would not only devastate Europe, but also destabilize global politics. That fear pushed leaders to consider something radical. For the first time, rebuilding an entire continent would require cooperation beyond national borders.
In 1947, the United States proposed an unprecedented idea. Instead of punishing Europe or demanding immediate repayment, it offered massive financial assistance to rebuild European economies. This initiative became known as the Marshall Plan. Over 4 years, the U.S. sent billions of dollars worth of money, machinery, food, fuel, and raw materials to Europe. But the plan wasn't just about financial aid. It forced cooperation. Countries had to plan together, trade with one another, and coordinate reconstruction efforts. It helped stabilize currencies, restart factories, and restore confidence in financial systems. As production returned, jobs followed. Goods slowly reappeared on store shelves. Money began to regain meaning. People started to believe in the future again. The Marshall Plan did not instantly fix Europe's problems, but it stopped the downward spiral. It prevented collapse at a critical moment. More importantly, it showed that rebuilding systems, rather than punishing failure, was the fastest path to stability. Hope returned before prosperity did, and that made all the difference.
Europe didn't nearly collapse because it lost a war. It nearly collapsed because its systems were destroyed: factories, money, trust, and cooperation. War breaks more than buildings. It breaks confidence, stability, and belief in the future. An economy doesn't fail when money runs out. It fails when production stops, trust disappears, and cooperation breaks down. Europe survived not because of luck, but because rebuilding focused on restoring functioning systems instead of seeking punishment or revenge. Stability came before growth. Cooperation came before competition. The post-war recovery shows how fragile modern societies really are. Prosperity depends on systems working together: economic, political, and social. After World War II, Europe came dangerously close to the edge. The fact that it pulled back is one of the most important and fragile stories in modern history. And it reminds us that peace alone is not enough. Only functioning systems can keep societies standing.
If this helped you understand how fragile economies really are, like the video, subscribe for more simple history and economic stories, and comment.